Today, we are diving into one of history's biggest, most cautionary tales, the policy of appeasement. Back in the 1930s, the world's democracies were so desperate to stop another war from happening that they made concession after concession to aggressive powers. The hope? That it would buy peace. But instead, well, it helped pave the way for the deadliest war in human history. It's a huge paradox, right? How can a policy that's all about avoiding war actually help cause it? That's the big question we're going to unpack today. We're going to look at the logic, the massive gamble, and ultimately the catastrophic failure of appeasement. All right, let's get into it. So to really get why leaders made these choices, you have to transport yourself back to the 1930s. This wasn't a world looking for a fight. Not at all. It was a world absolutely terrified of one, still reeling from the unbelievable devastation of World War I. Okay, so let's get a clear definition here. What do we actually mean by appeasement? Well, at its core, it's a strategy where you give an aggressor what they want. You make concessions, political, material, whatever, in the hope that it'll satisfy them and, they'll just stop pushing for more. It's a bet, really. A bet that compromise can calm a crisis down. And you just can't overstate the psychological scar tissue left by the Great War. This wasn't some distant historical event. It was a fresh, gaping wound. For people in Britain and France, the idea of sending another generation of young men into the meat grinder of trench warfare was, well, it was unthinkable. The public pressure to avoid war at any cost was just immense. So when you keep that in mind, it starts to become a lot clearer that appeasement wasn't just born out of fear or weakness. To the people who designed the policy, it felt logical, it felt pragmatic, and honestly, it even felt moral. It was all based on a very specific set of arguments. Let's break those down. There were really three main pillars holding this whole thing up. First, like we said, the trauma of World War I. Second, you have the Great Depression. Countries were just economically shattered. They didn't feel like they had the money or the resources for a huge military buildup. And third, well, there was this widespread feeling of guilt. A lot of people believed the Treaty of Versailles had been way too harsh on Germany, and that maybe, just maybe, some of Hitler's early demands were actually pretty reasonable. And, there was a strategic calculation here too. For leaders who knew deep down that they weren't ready for a major war, appeasement felt like a way to kick the can down the road. The hope was that every concession would buy them another year, maybe two, to rearm and get their economies back in shape, just in case the absolute worst happened. So with that logic firmly in place, the policy was put into action. And what happened next was this predictable cycle, an act of aggression followed by a concession. Each one was a gamble that this time it would finally be enough to secure the peace for good. You could see the pattern forming all through the 1930s. The League of Nations was basically powerless when Japan invaded Manchuria and Italy invaded Ethiopia. Then, boom, 1936, Hitler marches his troops into the Rhineland, a massive violation of the Versailles Treaty. And the response? A lot of angry words, but no real action. All of this just builds and builds until it culminates in 1938 with the Munich Agreement. Munich, that was the absolute peak of the appeasement policy. It was the ultimate test. Britain and France agreed to just hand over a strategic German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, to Hitler. And here's the crazy part. Czechoslovakia, the country being literally carved up, wasn't even invited to the meeting. And this quote just perfectly captures the feeling of that moment. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain comes back from Munich, he gets off the plane, waves this piece of paper in the air, and he famously declares that he has secured peace for our time. And for one brief, shining moment, it really looked like the gamble had actually paid off. But it was a mirage. It was a completely fatal miscalculation. That peace was built on a foundation of sand because the entire policy was based on a fundamental, disastrous misunderstanding of the very person they were trying to appease. This chart just lays it bare. This was the core problem. The Allies and Hitler were basically operating in two completely different universes. The Allies thought, okay, if we address Germany's legitimate complaints, they'll become a responsible, peaceful partner in Europe. But Hitler's reality? He saw things totally differently. For him, concessions weren't signs of goodwill, they were proof of weakness. Every victory just emboldened him to push for more and more and more. And the fallout from this miscalculation was immediate. Less than 6 months after being given the Sudetenland, Hitler broke his promise and just rolled his tanks into the rest of Czechoslovakia. That was the moment the whole illusion just shattered.
When he finally invaded Poland that September, the policy of appeasement was officially dead and the Second World War had begun.
So what was the final bill for this failed policy? What was the real price of peace? Tragically, it was a war that became even more destructive and widespread than it might have been otherwise. The consequences were just catastrophic. Think about it. By giving away territory like the Sudetenland, the Allies didn't just strengthen Germany's military and its industry, they also broadcasted to the entire world that they were weak, that they were indecisive, that they wouldn't stand up to a bully. The whole idea of international security just crumbled. So here's the crucial lesson. Appeasement taught the world something brutal. By desperately trying to avoid a conflict in the short term, the democratic powers allowed the threat to grow, to fester, until it became so much more powerful, so much more confident. At that point, confrontation wasn't just necessary, it was completely inevitable. And all of this leaves us with a question that echoes way beyond the 1930s. We're taught that compromise is a virtue, right? It's the cornerstone of diplomacy. But the story of appeasement forces us to ask a really tough question. At what point does that virtue become a vice? When does the desire for peace become so all-consuming that it actually becomes dangerous, putting real, lasting peace even further out of reach? It's something to think about.